There aren't many situations when a video game developer is given heavy creative control over a project. Modern games are usually enormous endeavors with hundreds to thousands of developers, unqualified leadership, and absurdly large budgets. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, creativity is usually very quickly killed off. So today, we are going to explore a game made by the creative, unfiltered mind of a Japanese developer named Suda51, Killer7. Just a few general warnings for everyone watching. This game is heavily charged with political messaging and extreme depictions of death, sex, and violence. It's definitely not a game for every gamer, but it's a wicked experience for those who are looking for one, which is why I will only be spoiling notable portions of the game for anyone who would like to go and play it themselves. Sit back, grab your friend, and welcome to this beautiful, crafted fever dream.
There are people who have been dying to see you. Now, close your eyes.
In 2001, the GameCube dropped to a bit of a Magikarp-sized splash. However, Capcom had brainstormed a project to attempt to boost hardware sales called the Capcom 5. These were a set of 5 titles with the express purpose of funding and supporting new intellectual property. Fortunately, it was mostly a success. Precisely 4 of those games were actually released in that 2-year period. Killer7 is one of those games, with only one commercial failure, which I will be talking about very soon. Killer7 is an action-adventure game released back in 2005. You play as a world-class syndicate of assassins controlled by the US government known as the Killer7. But there is a catch. They are one man with 7 personalities. Each personality seems to have their own individual bodies, though it also seems like they are controlled by a dominant personality named Garcian. What stands out immediately is the extremely vivid and tritone cel-shaded visuals with a mix of 3D rendered snapshots. There are clear references to early 2000s pop culture, Japanese philosophy, and stylistic film noir. This game takes place in an alternate version of Earth in the early 2000s, with the plot following a sporadic, flashy political adventure filled with weird and kooky characters. The game follows a timeline leading down the list of Garcian's political assassination targets. But first, I'll give a little introduction to the plot. The 4 powers of the world have unanimously decided that war is not very cool. By signing a treaty to end all international conflict by launching all their nuclear weapons into the atmosphere to put a full stop to terrorism. Codenamed Fireworks, the now worldwide symbol of peace. However, as smart as they are, they forgot about one other effective method: biological warfare. A new terrorist group called Heaven Smile has targeted the United Nations with factory-produced, virus-infected, exploding humans. Only distinguishable features on them being the bright smile they wear on their faces and their evil laughter. But thankfully, you're an assassin, so you can leave the politics to the Twitch streamers. The game starts immediately with this weirdly cinematic noir intro showing off 2 important characters, Garcian Smith and Christopher Mills. It has immediate vibes to old school movies like Sin City, down to the monologuing in between one-liners backed by some smooth jazz. The dialogue is a bit odd because it's really impressive, but I can't exactly tell if it's well written, buried in deeper meaning, or just so fucking stupid that I find it entertaining.
What were you doing here? Cleaning up. Our head chef always tells us that an ideal kitchen is a kitchen clean enough that you can lick the floor. Anyway, it's the least that I can do for them.
The others, the chef, the waiters, where are they?
Those guys with the strange smiles. You saw them?
It's dangerous, Aki. Get out of here.
Awesome.
Eliminating the Heaven Smile headquarters and capturing your leader is the only objective for this first mission. You enter the lobby and meet our first Heaven Smile, displaying immediately that some humans are being converted into smiles directly somehow. First interaction of weirdness is Iwazaru, this ghost-like figure that alludes to the three wise monkeys, the Japanese proverbial principle, see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. Iwazaru is the name of the monkey who speaks no evil. He also speaks in a very weird way with this eerie, robotic, almost omniscient echo behind his speech. We can only assume he's a servant to the Smiths because he refers to them as master. It kind of sounds like some English, but layered with a ton of distortion. While researching some of this video, I learned later that some of the NPCs actually use text-to-speech, which is very interesting. Right after speaking with Iwazaru, you visit the very first save room for the game, Armin's room. This is where much of the game's mechanics take place. You may swap personalities here thanks to this conveniently placed television in each room. Much of the game's mechanics are explained through the ghastly voice of Iwazaru. It's probably the most Japanese-ass game design game I've seen in a long time, but in the weirdest way imaginable. You're introduced immediately to the game's personalities without much explanation other than a quip or two and their appearance that shows off their personality.
What the fuck are you looking at?
Once you reach the top of the headquarters, we get another tidbit of information from Travis, one of the NPCs, describing the leader as the Queen, wearing a nice sexual tank top, by the way. He calls her an evolved Heaven Smile with boosted explosive power. After a few rooms and ability puzzles, we reach the top to get one more talk with Travis. Something I never understood was why CCTV cameras are what triggered the swap from Garcian to the personas. So right before the boss, Garcian makes a brief entrance only to introduce us to Harmon Smith. Welcome to the first boss fight. Killer7 is great at subverting your expectations in more ways than one. This fight is merely the beginning. It's actually just nothing special. You would expect your first boss fight to be this grand spectacle after all the bullshit you've seen up to this point. But it's merely a way to introduce one of the commanding presences of the game, Kunlan. This sequence perfectly explains the shit you'll expect from Killer7, and what better way than to just show you.
The size of the world has changed. It's changed to the size where you can control it with your hands, just like a PDA. The world will keep getting smaller.
Harmon Smith is a confusing existence because it's implied that he leads the Killer7 as a Smith, but he is clearly not directly included in the 7 personalities. Each persona has a specific gameplay style, abilities, and a distinct weapon assigned to them. They each use unique interactions while navigating through each level. This is the bread and butter of the gameplay. Combat and exploration are both morphed and designed in tandem, so let's talk about them together. Killer7 has fun and incredibly distinct locations, from amusement parks to the Dominican Republic. Despite being a lower resolution, the zones are very pretty and nice to look at. However, this isn't limited to just exploration. Every single part of the UI is also aesthetically pleasing. It reminds me a little bit of the cool-ass Persona UI design, which I really enjoy. Throughout these missions, we unknowingly involve ourselves deeper and deeper into the conspiracy regarding the true role of Japan in US politics. From what we can tell, the United States seems to have the upper hand in having control over the Fifth Syndicate, with a few of the assassination targets being Japanese representatives stationed in the US. To many of the uninitiated, they would definitely call this story bad and incoherent. On top of that, it has some very questionable yet cool depictions of death and bloodshed. While it is true that it's a bit difficult to properly explain, it's a bizarre and complex story that is best to experience on your own. It takes a concoction of dozens of mechanics and narratives that should never work in theory but somehow pull it off. As long as you toss away any grandiose expectations, it's not hard to fully experience completely. And I'll clarify a bit more on that idea later. There's even some nicely animated cutscenes later in the game for the anime fans, combined with the normal directed cutscenes to flesh out the storytelling.
吐きだめに降り立ち純情可憐な花一輪豚の群れを殺めてくれよヘッドマスターニートガールあやめブラックバーン
Now to get to the gameplay that I've been kind of dodging a little bit, Killer7's gameplay involves a on-rails movement system mixed with a number of different genres mechanics. A Resident Evil style camera with only specific angles being shown to you when you walk in a single direction throughout the levels, along with a first-person mode, which is where the shooter tag of the game comes from. The gameplay loop is fairly straightforward with a variety between the personalities and the many enemy types. Though some might argue that the two personas, Dan and Coyote, both share very similar playstyles. Each level has a predetermined amount of an item called soul shells. You collect these soul shells and then you're allowed to enter the boss's domain. Speaking of the enemies, they vary extremely from tiny little mosquitoes to giant baby birthing walls of flesh, which coincidentally we learned from Travis that this was the primary way the Heaven Smiles spread their virus on a large scale. The control scheme and gameplay is a massive focal point when it comes to criticism of Killer7, but that's why we care about these scores and not those ones. I believe that we are in a better place in terms of acceptance of games as a art form. Back in the 2000s, games were flat out denied the option of being labeled as art. They even had a label put on them to be called art games and not just games as a whole. These games in particular being living proof of that example. While a valid opinion, I find the disdain for the gameplay extremely misplaced. It's not as if arcade games on consoles were non-existent on the PS2. However, it's always about intention. One game that had a similar reception is the survival horror game Deadly Premonition. But there is a massive difference between these two. One has limited gameplay and controls, while the other is labeled the best bad game ever made. Killer7 clearly had a lot to say, yet leaves much up to interpretation. But being an honest man, I can admit that while being very simple, the controls are unconventional. However, simplicity can still contain depth. As mentioned before, the exploration is on rails. It's one button to move forward and the other to turn around, which can be sped up if you quick turn while fully sprinting. Though that's not to say that I don't take issue with this system. There are definitely times where it's a big fuck you, especially when you're not 1,000,000% sure where enemies spawn. And sometimes they can spawn right next to a doorway that you need to walk into, only for you to take damage immediately without even seeing what it was. Thankfully, a majority of the Smile variants are super slow otherwise. Whenever enemies spawn, they announce their existence with laughter. Everything you kill in the game drops a specific type of blood. Thick and thin. Thick blood is treated like XP that you use to upgrade a predetermined set of stats for each personality. Upgrades like power, speed, and critical, they do exactly what they sound like they do. While thin blood is used to fill up these various vials that are consumed to shoot special bullets or as a way of healing. Iwazaru calls them the Devil's Bullets. These special vials have particular effects for each personality. Dan, for example, his shots have 3 levels, the last level granting a massive projectile. And more notably, Kaede, Aide, whatever the fuck, possessing her servant Mizaru, the last wise monkey, which reveals hidden visions or anything related to blood. That would have rounded out the whole list of the 3 wise monkeys, but I apparently missed out on one. Kikazaru, hear no evil. In short, being able to echolocate the soul shells. The smiles are a unique existence because, as mentioned before, they are biological in nature. However, their appearances appear more demonic and mutated. They are largely disparate, each having their specific abilities, but consistently being flying bombs while keeping the weak point systems between. Shooting these weak points either dismembers that body part or has a chance to instantly kill the enemy. Something that I find fascinating is the difference between insta-killing enemies versus killing them normally. Exploding into ropes of actual blood, but when insta-killed they disintegrate into what I can only imagine is thick blood? Just like the arcade shooters it's influenced by, you have infinite ammo, with no limit in terms of a shooter other than needing to reload. It's a satisfying shooter that feels clunky initially to play, but is refreshing once you get the hang of it. There is an inventory, yet it's very limited to mission-specific items, equipping your accessories, and changing their personalities. Let's start with the accessories, and don't worry, there won't be any dumbass trivial stat increases here. A major fourth of the gameplay involves using these rings to be used to solve specific puzzles or riddles. For example, using the fire ring to light these candles, or the wind ring to blow away or move objects. By the end of the game, your arsenal of rings is massive. Some are used just for puzzles and some are just general bonuses. Things like giving a persona more health or increasing their damage by a flat amount. And they continue to have clever uses throughout the game to solve similar problems, but in different ways. The other way of navigation you have access to is a map, detailed in various sections like the location of items and places where a persona's ability or the rings can be used. So even though you don't have free movement, it's pretty easy ultimately to traverse through each level. Many could easily chalk this down to a negative because of how easy traversal becomes with the solution of puzzles basically being shown to you. I instantly die of cringe whenever I hear someone complain that puzzles are not hard in a game that's not a puzzle game. Bro, they're fine. They're literally fine. They're cool. It's cool. Me, Gungaga. The sound design is also a strong point that I feel needs to be praised. It's so satisfying to shoot your weapons, explode enemies' heads. Even switching between personalities has this absolutely euphoric explosion. The soundtrack too is loaded with dozens of suave jazz tracks, cinematic drama openers, and fucking dirty dick synthwave jammers. There's one thing that you can take away from Killer7, it has to be how fucking hard the soundtrack goes. It's at its best when it's combined with the almost comically directed cutscenes.
Do you have the impact point yet?
Yes, sir. It's Japan.
What? Are the fireworks ready? No, forget it. Japan is our ally. No, we're not authorized to make that kind of decision. Forget authorization. We have to do something now or else. We can't just let it happen. Get the president on the line.
You could hear the obvious passion seeping out of the game with how good the voice acting actually is, and it doesn't seem to be just the remaster, it was just that fucking good. A decision that is really cool to me is that every NPC persists throughout each level of the game. There are NPCs like Travis or Yoon-hyun. God, why is there so many fucking Japanese and Korean names? Dude, come on, man. Travis is a serial killer that claims that he was killed by Garcian in the past. In each level, he's spotted wearing a tank top with different text on it every time you see him. He's usually chilling around the level, giving hints or dropping occasional backstory about ourselves or the current political affairs. Because of how these NPCs persist, it almost alludes that death is not the final step in this universe. It turns out that anyone killed by the Smith Syndicate lives on as apparitions called remnant psyches. Yoon Hyun is on the opposite end with strong Death Note vibes. He's usually rocking a suit jacket and carries a bloody red mask in one hand. Clearly it's implied that Yoon was killed by the Smiths at some point, but no real details or backstory as to why and how. He mainly provides hints to the player on solving the various puzzles throughout the game. Shoot the mask and you get more information, but uh-oh, demons lust for blood. You need to give up some of your thick blood reserves for said information. It is heavily implied that it's a demon separate from Yoon. It'll help you out, but it'll have to insult you first. There is one other psyche that I want to bring into the spotlight. Susie. Susie is a severed head that is usually holding one of the rings in her mouth. The more we talk to her, the more she opens up about her intimate history with violence and mental illness. So it's a bit obvious that she's very clearly both a psychopath and a sociopath. One of the stories being the time that her first boyfriend hit her with a rock accidentally, but her response is to shoot him in the head. The last one I want to mention is the courier pigeons with all the varying names. These pigeons all deliver memos to the Smiths that contain information about the current targets or the individual Smiths. Some of them are directly referring to the events that occurred prior to the game's story. Either way, it was always intriguing to hear what most NPCs had to say. At times, it was more entertaining to see the story unfold with all the characters rather than the gameplay loop, if I'll be completely honest. I kind of skimped over it a little bit, but just in case you were wondering, there are actually many cool boss fights. I kind of jested with the whole subverting your expectations thing, but the boss fights are actually very cool. Each fight is widely distinctive depending on each target. The one fight that actively put a smile on my face was the one with this guy named Curtis Blackburn. Here's a little section to introduce this badass dual-wielding weirdo being the third assassination target. Curtis was found to be one of the men behind a orphan human trafficking front allegedly used in the production of the Human Smiles. He was supposedly an old mentor of Dan Smith, who then murdered him for supposedly betraying him. It's a gangster-ass cowboy standoff using a pigeon's flight to decide when to draw their weapons. There's a variety of cool fights that is just like this one, so look forward to them. Even a fighting game style one where you fight against some Power Ranger parodies. That was merely a taste into the demented universe that is Killer7. The game is filled to the brim with weird and interesting design choices that will constantly surprise you. If you can look past the limited gameplay, there is a very special game waiting for you in Killer7. Maybe you could learn to appreciate it like I did, and if not, you could always binge the story elsewhere. I hope this video was digestible, because I wanted to tackle it in a way that seemed weird and unconventional, just like the game does. Killer7 is a giant fucking flying bomb of a risk that I don't think any company nowadays has the balls to try to pull off. Maybe someday we'll see another idea like the Capcom 5 take off again. Take care, everyone.
By the way, that video on that failed